3, 2, 1. How do I look? Dreadful. Okay, if you're wondering why every video starts like this, it's because I use these really exotic vintage lenses. And when I use the word exotic, I mean difficult. I do have modern lenses, I just choose to make my fucking life difficult. Okay, brothers, sisters, comrades and friends, welcome to Bat Country. There's no agreed consensus on what a rock bottom is or isn't. It's in the eye of the beholder, like beauty. But generally, when someone in recovery talks about their rock bottom, they're generally talking about a single event or time period in which they were at their very lowest. And looking back, they recognize that period or that event as a catalyst for getting sober. For some morbid reason that I'm too scared to interrogate fully, I am very interested in other people's rock bottom stories. Captivated by the idea of human experience, by somebody bottoming out and then being willing to share that experience with the rest of us. I find something very compelling about that, very honest and very vulnerable. Hearing other people talk about their rock bottoms, whether it's on YouTube or in groups or whatever, however they choose to interpret that phrase, rock bottom, I think it's instructive for people new on their recovery, people new to sobriety. Listening to other people talk about the lowest points of their addiction or their alcohol problems gave me confidence to address my own, to face up to them. There is, of course, a morbid kind of curiosity and human drama about these stories that makes them inherently compelling. We're all interested in those kinds of stories. But there's something educational about them too, in a sense. Listening to somebody talk about their rock bottom is a little like listening to a skydiver talk about being tangled up in their own ropes and having to cut the parachute free. There's something very exhilarating about listening to someone walking up to the edge of what we can experience and then walking back from it. That's what a rock bottom story is, right? It's good to know where our limits are, how much we can put ourselves through and still make it out. Because of the relatively extreme nature of my own alcohol use before I was sober, which included essentially trying to drink myself to death with every drink, I have several experiences which would constitute a rock bottom. Now, I've bottomed out several times and come back. I've picked one kind of at random to tell you about today. And I'll save details of other bottoming out processes for later. I'm going to do a series of these because I've had more than one. And I'm going to start with the most dramatic, the most objectively interesting one. So, are you sitting comfortably? Then we'll begin. A couple of disclaimers before we get stuck into it. First, I don't think this story requires any content warnings or trigger warnings or anything like that. It's not that kind of story. But it is a bit depressing and it's quite intense. It's worth remembering as I go through this that I am okay now. I have a lot of sobriety under my belt. And I've put all of the stuff that I'm about to tell you, I've put it to use in my sobriety. So it's going to sound terrible and scary. And I can't say for sure it was worth it. But it does serve a purpose in my daily life now. So when things get a bit rough in this story, know that I'm okay. I'm okay now. Things worked out for the best. Second, this is actually my second attempt at filming a rock bottom story. The one I filmed first, which I'll save for a later date, was a far more ordinary, relatable rock bottom experience. A little bit more emotional and a little bit less crazy. The story that I've decided to show today and to talk about is not a relatable one. For a number of reasons, not everybody can possibly experience the kind of rock bottom I'm about to describe. My previous videos, I've tried to keep them quite relatable, quite realistic, so that as many people as possible might be able to find something to relate to within the story. This isn't quite like that because it is just so weird. This really is a wild ride, so buckle up. But that's why I'm choosing to tell it today, just purely because it's an interesting story. Okay, this requires some context first. So, at the start of 2018, I was living in Shanghai, in China, where I was the global brand manager for this kind of crazy Swedish luxury brand. Solid gold sex toys and that kind of thing. One of them was worth about $15,000, actually, a solid gold sex toy. And I left it in the back of a taxi in New York. Whoops. Those years that I spent in Shanghai were the best of my life. The most exciting. I loved my work. I loved my lifestyle. I lived relatively well. My salary was good for Shanghai. I was happy there. But eventually that life began to get on top of me. Or towards the end, I was drinking daily, and there was an increase in the intake of hard drugs. I'm not really a drug guy, but as the life got on top of me, that became a larger part of my experience. And often I didn't even know what it was I was taking. Not being a particularly big drug guy, I was an alcohol guy. I wasn't always certain what I was putting in my body. And there was some very grimy, casual sex, and it was just not a good scene for me by the end of my time there. I knew I was beginning to have trouble. My behavior was beginning to change. The addictive patterns of my personality were becoming more and more obvious. I was about 33 at that time, in 2018. And I would leave work at 5:30 p.m. and I'd be drunk by the time I got home at 6 p.m. Pretty much every day, just casually drinking from a bottle of Johnny Walker Red Label as I walked home from the office. Now, I try as hard as possible not to romanticize any of my drinking history. I'm well aware of the risks of doing that. But I missed that. I missed that half an hour, 45-minute walk home from the office. I missed those humid evenings wandering around Shanghai Stadium and Shujiahui, listening to the cicadas, walking back to my apartment with a bottle of whiskey inside my pocket and not a care in the world. Well, there is no way I will ever be able to return to that, and I am aware of the danger of romanticizing that. I do miss it. I can't do it anymore. I will die. It's just the way it is. I was able to do that for a while, for, I don't know, a year or two. I was able to drink a bottle of whiskey on the way home. But in time, inevitably, I started missing work and doing increasingly dangerous and reckless stuff. My walks home from the office got longer and longer every day to allow me some extra time to drink. And I'd find myself, instead of going home, I would find myself in seedy bars doing seedy things. I remember I'd been given a bicycle as a gift, a really nice one. And a few days later, I was cycling it home and I locked it up outside to go and get drunk somewhere. And I never found it again. I never found the bike or where I had parked it. I went searching for it. It hadn't been stolen, of that I'm pretty sure. I just couldn't remember where I'd put it. It's probably still there. But that's how it starts, isn't it? Small ways before the big ways. I began to recognize the fact that I was feeling unhealthy and that I needed a change. I decided I needed to kind of starve out this growing alcohol problem and the reckless living, which was having an impact on my professional and personal life. And ultimately, I decided to leave Shanghai and cycle back to London alone. I'll just say that again, just so we're clear. My intention was to cycle from Shanghai to London alone, along the Northern Silk Road. It sounded like a good idea at the time. It sounded like adventure. But I wasn't aware of the seriousness of my growing problem. No one is at that stage. Before you seek treatment, you can't fathom that you might need treatment. I just had this nagging feeling that something wasn't right. something that needed to be fixed, but I didn't believe I needed treatment or anything like that. In fact, I saw it slightly differently. The Mongolians have a phrase, the paraphrasing is something like, every man should walk alone in the desert. The implication being that you can't really know yourself until you have been alone in the vastness of the Gobi Desert. You can't know how strong or resilient you are until you've had that resilience tested by the desert. And something about that appealed to me. It appealed to the reckless adventurer in me. And that's what I wanted to do. I wanted to walk alone in the desert. The bike ride along the ancient Northern Silk Road route, that was my treatment. Whatever this growing problem was that I was aware of inside of me, I was going to take it out to the Taklamakan Desert, and I was going to strangle it there and leave it behind in the sand. And to an extent, for a while, that worked. Did stay sober for a long time. But that's enough context. Let's get to the point. All right. Shortly before I left for that journey, I suffered a very serious head injury. A fractured skull. I was knocked off my bicycle while I was training, and then on the journey, in the relatively early stages, in Gansu province, I was struck on the head by a rock in a landslide. It was quite small, but it was enough. I believe, and it's not even a belief, I know that those head injuries, which wouldn't be fully diagnosed until much, much later, had an impact on my behaviour. It changed my personality slightly. Head injuries, even mild ones like mine, can do that. Some people get very aggressive. Some people get very withdrawn. It manifests differently because all of our neurochemistry is different. But for me, it made me very impulsive, very reckless, made my decision-making very, very poor, and it just made me a very bad candidate to cycle across the world on my own. I was in danger before I started. And one of the ways the impulsivity of that head injury manifested for me was in alcohol. I drank more and more and more. It was bad and it was getting worse every day, but I didn't know. On one side of it, an alcohol use disorder will lie to you. And on the other hand, I had a brain injury which I didn't know anything about. And by the time I arrived in Kyrgyzstan, after about 4 months of cycling, I was drinking very heavily most days. In fact, by the time I arrived in Kazakhstan, about a month or 5 weeks after that, it was normal that my water bottle on my bicycle would be filled with vodka instead. I would set off in the early morning at 7 a.m. I'd wake up wherever I'd fallen the night before, and I would drink in the saddle, cycling and drinking as I was going, getting drunker and drunker and drunker in the saddle until I passed out by the side of the road in the late afternoon in some unnamed, godforsaken part of the Central Asian steppe. That was my life for quite a long time. Drinking, cycling until I was too drunk to cycle, fall off the bike, wake up where I landed, carry on doing it. Absolutely insane. How I am alive, I don't know. Cycling when you're off your face at 4,500 meters in altitude through the Pamir Mountains, or along the southern fringe of the Gobi Desert when there's no town around you for 200 kilometers in any direction and nothing but motorists with no licenses and no insurance and driving at 150 miles per hour all around you. It's just... Well, I just don't know how I survived that. I cycled across the Pamir Mountains and into the steppe of Central Asia out of my mind drunk. It's a dangerous place at the best of times, let alone when you are out of control. And Kazakhstan is where things all started to really go wrong for me. First, in a city in the Tian Shan mountain range in the far east of Kazakhstan, a city called Almaty, I was robbed. My bicycle was stolen while I was on it, I might add. It was taken at knife point. Then after that, I hustled my way to another city called Aktau on the Caspian Sea on the coast. They call Aktau the Caspian Riviera. I assure you it is no such thing. It is a toxic waste dump of a city. And I mean that sincerely. That's what it is. An old Soviet, what they used to call a secret Soviet city, which is to say it was a nuclear city. Originally in the middle of the 60s, there was a nuclear plant there that provided electricity to various points around the Caspian. And they just dumped all of that nuclear waste into the salt flats, a lake that used to be there called Mangistau. Now it's just a dried up lake bed. And it's still radioactive to this day. And that's where I was. I was blitzed the whole way there, my whole journey across Kazakhstan. Not a moment of sobriety. I remember little snapshots, bits and pieces of that journey. I remember being kicked awake after falling asleep on the floor of a train carriage somewhere in the desert. And the man who kicked me was this very tanned, pot-bellied man, and he was shouting at me in Russian, his yellow teeth and bad breath right in my face. And I was incredibly drunk. And he was just shouting and shouting, and he had hold of my shirt, and I threw a big drunken punch at him, and I missed, and I slumped to the floor. Only to realise the next morning when I saw the guy, who was also drunk, I should say, when I saw him in uniform, and realised that he was the train manager. And when the train stopped at some local train station, I hopped off onto the platform and I bought a cheap bottle of Kazakh vodka and gave it to him by way of an apology. And we sat together and drank it, and we got drunk together. While he was working, he was running the train while he was drinking vodka with me. It's a lawless place. And for a person like me, by that stage, not just dangerously out of control, but really vulnerable. Robbed and beaten and all of that stuff. It was extra dangerous. I was in Aktau for a couple of weeks, waiting for a cargo ship to arrive to take me across the Caspian Sea to Baku in Azerbaijan, where I was going to continue my journey, so I thought. But while I was waiting for it, I was sleeping rough most nights, drinking my brains out, and I was robbed twice. I was robbed regularly, but twice at gunpoint by the police in uniform. In fact, the first time wasn't really a gunpoint. What they did was they picked me up off the street in the back of an unmarked police car, and they drove me to a military base, as if to indicate to me that I had no power. And I paid their bribe, and then a couple of days later, word had got around the precinct, I suppose, that there was a drunken foreigner lingering around the beach and around the waterfront, and they were just taking their turns. And the second time it happened, they drove me out onto that salt flat, Mangistau salt flat, and pulled a revolver out of the glove box, beaten up old snub-nosed thing, some old Soviet piece of shit, and put it in my face and demanded the money that way. I was already bad by then, man. Like, I was already in a bad, bad place. But those experiences just made it worse. They put me more on edge. The more danger there was, the more I drank in response to the danger, and the more danger I put myself in as a result. And by that stage, the moment I woke up, I would immediately go into early stages of withdrawal because I was drinking so heavily that an 8-hour gap in drinking would be enough to begin the process of withdrawal. So I was either drunk or I was suffering the whole time. In Kazakhstan, they sell 2-litre bottles of iced tea, very sugary. And I would buy one of those 2-litre bottles of iced tea and a 1-litre bottle of cheap vodka. 1 litre, not 750 millilitres or centilitres, whatever that measurement is. A full litre. And I would go outside the shop and empty out a litre or drink some of the iced tea. And then I would fill the bottle up with that bottle of vodka, throw the bottle away, and that would be my whole day right there until I blacked out from it. Just wandering the streets of this toxic waste dump of a city, hanging around with stray dogs and stray people, No contact with my family. No money. My phone and my cash had all been stolen and my Chinese bank cards didn't work. I was about as alone as it's possible to be. And even then, I didn't recognize how much danger I was in. One of the problems with a place as rough as Aktau in Kazakhstan is that I'm not a small guy. I'm a relatively large person. I'm not huge, but back then I was in really good shape, despite all of the drinking. I had just cycled 10,000 kilometers across deserts and over mountain ranges, and I arrived in this city with tattoos on my hands and a big scruffy beard and a shaven head, and I was missing teeth, and I looked tough. And everywhere else I'd been to that point, looking tough had provided some measure of protection against the kind of people who might want to do me harm. But in a city like Aktau, where most of the population are old Russians, ex-convicts who have been sent to do industrial work, or people who were fought in Chechnya, old Chechens, there was lots of them. The bigger and tougher you look in a place like that, the more those people want to fight you. They want to test themselves against you. Most of them were these old Chechens, and they had seen death and violence up close, and they were utterly fearless, and they were deeply damaged people. Just all of them alcoholics, all of them suffering from the trauma that the various wars in which they must have fought, or the prisons from which spat them out. They carried that trauma to their daily life, and they had no fear. None, especially not of someone like me. To them, I was a target. I was a target. I was a victim to be robbed and fought. And there was a lot of that happened. In fact, I was robbed so many times that at night there was still a lake in the middle of the town. And it had pedal boats at the side. So in the daytime, when the weather was nice, you go and pay like $2 and you go and pedal around this little lake. At night, under cover of darkness, I would go to the lake and I would steal one of those pedal boats, and I would float it out into the middle of that little lake with a loaf of bread and a bottle of vodka, and I would sleep there, just floating on the water, because at least there no one could rob me while I was drunkenly asleep. That could be a rock bottom right there, but this gets a lot worse. So eventually, the cargo ship that I was waiting for did arrive in port in Aktau, and I made my way towards it. In fact, I'd been sleeping at the port for a while because it was outside the city and therefore outside the reach of the police, who knew I was in the town and knew I was a soft target for them. So I was sleeping and staying at the port, which had a little shop that sold vodka and bread and that kind of thing. And when it was my turn to go through the police checkpoint out onto the dock and then onto the ship, I did what I always did at these times. I slipped $20 into my passport and I handed it over to the, I guess, customs official, to the policeman at the counter. And the cop took my passport and he opened it and he slid the money on the desk and pushed it back to me. Didn't even look at me. And I kind of pushed it back towards him and he pushed it back towards me. And without looking up, he told me my visa was out of date. And it wasn't. And it shouldn't have mattered because I was trying to leave anyway. But it was a scam, obviously. He was trying to elicit a bribe. And I knew it was that. I knew it was a scam. I'd been in Kazakhstan long enough to know. So I put more money on the table, and he rejected that too. He and the other cops in the terminal where I was leaving, they wanted everything I had. They wanted all of the money that I had on me, and they weren't going to let me go until I had handed everything over. And they wanted everything. I mean, I was leaving the country. What the fuck am I going to do? I'm trying to get out. So I'm easy money to them. What am I going to do? Nothing. I'm going to leave. Never see them again. I'm the easiest person to rob. Except I had been drinking heavily. and I was drunk at that terminal. So as the cop behind the counter had been trying to get the money off me, he had put my passport on the table in front of him. And as we were talking, I had slid it off the desk into my hand, and another cop had arrived next to me. He wanted his share of the money, I suppose. He was there to guarantee that I paid. And he went to snatch my passport out of my hand. And I wasn't willing to accept that, not anymore. I'd been robbed and scammed enough by the police, and I wanted to leave. So as he reached in, I grabbed him by the wrist and I pinned his wrist to his hip, and I wound up and I landed the hardest punch I have ever thrown in anger at somebody. And it connected with the side of his jaw, and he scattered all over the floor, his hat spinning across the floor of the terminal. And before I knew anything, someone had run up behind me and swept my legs, pinned me to the floor, and gave me a real beating. I punched a cop. They all wanted a piece of me, and I'm not sure if it comes across on camera, but these teeth, they're fake. They kicked my teeth out. They bundled me out of the terminal into the back of one of those little Russian vans, a UAZ 452, I think it's called, like the loaf van, and gave me another kicking in there. And when I came to, I was in a concrete room with this horrible kind of flickering fluorescent lighting. And the room was like painted like military olive green up until halfway up the wall, and then the rest was like this kind of nicotine yellow. Like a KGB interrogation room. That was the kind of vibe that it had. I wasn't cuffed at that point, but the room I was in had metal bars that kind of looked out into a corridor with a window on the other side. And from that cell, from that little room, I was able to see the cargo ship that I was supposed to be on leave. And I knew that I was stuck. When they put me in that room, they'd left me with my rucksack and stuff, because I don't think I was... Things just work differently there. I'm not sure if I was under arrest at that point. I'm not sure if I was ever arrested. But they left me my backpack, and before I'd got on the boat, I had bought enough vodka for myself, for any friends that I made on the ship, and for any of the crew of the cargo ship that I needed to win over. It was a lot of vodka, and I was left in that little room alone with it, with nothing to do apart from watch that ship sail away and drink. Now we're starting to approach the rock bottom part of this story now. So I was already drunk when this very tough-looking cop arrived with an interpreter, young woman, and I was subjected to a 3-hour interrogation in that room. And quite regularly, the cop and the interpreter left the room to go and consult with each other, I suppose. They would leave every few minutes, for a few minutes, return, continue with questions, and then go out. And every time they stepped out of the room, I snuck that bottle of vodka out of my rucksack, unscrewed the lid, and sculled it. And then by the end of that 3-hour interview, I'd finished a litre of vodka in that time, and I was working on the second litre. Because I didn't care. I didn't care at that point. I was willing to push it as far as it would go, and beyond. And my memory of the interview itself is clouded now. But I remember how it ended. I was very drunk by that time, and it must have been quite obvious. And I had become belligerent. All the way through China and Kyrgyzstan and Tajikistan and stuff, I've been very careful not to be an asshole to cops. Doesn't do any good. Anywhere, it doesn't do any good to be belligerent to the police. It doesn't help. And that changed that day. And as we were concluding the interview, I looked at this cop and I leant across the table and I told him to go fuck himself. And he leant back and he said, in English, "Mister, you are not in Europe anymore." He'd been speaking Russian the entire time, not a single word of English. He'd been using his translator. But he deemed it necessary to say that in English, to prove that point, to make me understand the kind of trouble I was in. And then I was taken to jail. And I don't remember being processed. I was plastered by the time I arrived there. I don't remember being admitted to the jail. And you see, when I say that I didn't know how much trouble I was in, I really mean that. Because after this, we'll get to this in a moment, but I was put on trial, and I discovered the cop that I had punched had accused me of trying to steal his gun. And I didn't know at that time, I had no idea, but I was facing real prison time in Kazakhstan. In fact, I was even drunk at the trial, and it was a trial with like a serious one. It had 3 judges, all with the white wigs and the black robes and all of that stuff. I was drunk when I showed up to that. So when I arrived in the jail, this time, naturally, all of my stuff was taken off me. For me, the most pressing issue, of course, was the fact that it meant no more vodka. That was it. I was going to have to white knuckle an incredibly difficult withdrawal just on my own, without any warning, without any medical assistance. It's the middle of the fucking desert. There's no detox centers. What it meant was that over the next 7 days that I was there, I went through what must be one of the worst withdrawals you can imagine. Stuffed into a 110-degree jail cell with 5 other Russian and Kazakh criminals. I mean that. I don't say that to overgeneralize about them. But my first memory there was rolling over on my bunk, this kind of rusty old bed frame, and watching my cellmate pull out the lace from his boot, pulled the laces out of his boot, and then used it to stitch up a stab wound in his abdomen. And then he went to the toilet and he ran his fingers around the inside of it to get the disinfectant that they used to clean the toilets, and he used that to clean his wound. And he had a defensive wound on his forearm too, to match. Like, I think that he must have been in this position or something, because the stab wound had gone into his abdomen and then taken a chunk to match out of his forearm. And it was so deep. And everything below that gash on his arm was purple, like his fingertips were turning black. And I watched that guy stitch up his stab wound and clean it with toilet water while I was experiencing one of the worst withdrawals of my life. That moment right there, that was my rock bottom. I can't think of a better way to encapsulate a rock bottom than that moment, that image, which is forever seared into my mind. And I recognized that sounds far-fetched. And I would understand if you thought that perhaps I was exaggerating or telling tall tales in order to make myself look more interesting or something. But I can prove all of this stuff. When I was being led out of that jail, they gave me all of my stuff back, and including my phone, including like the temporary phone that I'd been using. And I used it to grab a photograph of that guy who'd been stabbed as a kind of, just to prove to myself that it really happened. And if you ask very nicely, reach out to me, I'll show you it. It's on my Instagram, actually. You can see the shoelace. I'm not making this stuff up. But just even though he was fixed up by that time, just one look at him, and you knew he wasn't much longer for this world. And I felt the same about me. So I was in that jail outside Aktau in Kazakhstan for about a week before I got a phone call, the first phone call that I'd had. And it was from the British Embassy in Astana, now called Nur Sultan. And they told me that I was going to be put on trial. A week of alcohol withdrawal in that Kazakhstan jail cell with the desert heat draining all of the life out of me. Scrounging cigarettes from people that the withdrawal had convinced me were plotting to murder me. I didn't even smoke before I got there. Any sleep that I would get, I would be woken from because I was screaming. My cellmates would prevent me from going to sleep because I was screaming. I was having terrible night terrors, part of the withdrawal, I guess. And I was screaming to the point that my cellmates were deliberately keeping me awake. And I was so sure that they were going to murder me that at night I would keep myself awake. I would watch the flies on the ceiling until daylight started to emerge in the little window that was up on the wall. And then I would try to snatch a few minutes of sleep while they were off getting breakfast or lunch or dinner. So that meant I didn't eat either. The food times were the times that I was trying actively to sleep. And that whole period, but specifically watching that guy stitch his wound up, that was my first rock bottom, I suppose. And I have to say it here on my little Backcountry YouTube channel for selfish reasons. Rock bottoms, they're not a competition. Everybody's recovery story is equal, and it's personal and unique to them. And they should all be equally respected. We shouldn't be comparing rock bottoms like we're playing top trumps with them, like mine is worse than yours. And even if we were, mine isn't even the worst that I've heard by far. Rock bottoms are not a competition, but at the same time, we are all human. And in those meetings, those 12-step meetings, I have to keep stories like that one to myself because it has the effect of making other people in the room less willing to share their own experiences, because mine is so extreme. So I talk about mine here instead. That's really what this channel is about. By venting here to you good people, really to myself, I save that space in the rooms for other people who need it more. Speaking of which, if you would like to share yours, please do so in the comments. I would love to read them. Like I said, I have a kind of objective interest in rock bottom stories. I know a lot of people find them depressing and we're not supposed to indulge in them, etc., but I find them interesting. I find them very compelling. And feel free to subscribe for more videos in the future, probably less intense than this one. And as always, see you next time, and good luck out there.